Imagine assembling a city of 500,000 heavily armed Americans in the middle of a featureless, scorching desert. Now imagine unleashing that city, equipped with the most lethal armored vehicles ever built, against the fourth largest army on the planet. It took months to build the hammer, but it only took 100 hours to swing it and completely shatter Saddam Hussein's military machine. This is the story of Operation Desert Storm, a masterclass in logistics, deception, and overwhelming firepower that rewrote the rules of modern warfare. Before we dissect the nuts and bolts of this armored annihilation, hit that subscribe button, like this video, and let us know in the comments if you think any modern military could replicate this logistical miracle today. To understand how the United States dismantled a massive regional power in just over 4 days, we have to rewind the clock and look at the strategic chessboard of the Middle East in the late 20th century. The roots of this conflict were buried deep in the bloody, mud-soaked trenches of the Iran-Iraq War. For 8 grueling years throughout the 1980s, Saddam Hussein threw millions of men into a meat grinder against Iran. It was a brutal, static conflict that looked a lot more like the Western Front of World War I than any modern battlefield. By the time the ceasefire was signed in 1988, Iraq had built a massive, battle-hardened military apparatus, but the country was completely bankrupt. Saddam owed tens of billions of dollars to his Arab neighbors, primarily Kuwait and Saudi Arabia, who had bankrolled his war to keep the Iranian Revolution at bay. Instead of paying his debts, Saddam accused Kuwait of slant drilling across the border into Iraq's Rumaila oil field and artificially depressing global crude prices to ruin the Iraqi economy. On August 2, 1990, Saddam stopped talking and started moving armor. Over 100,000 Iraqi troops and 2,000 tanks smashed across the border into Kuwait, swallowing the tiny, oil-rich nation in a matter of hours. The geopolitical shockwaves were immediate and severe. The Cold War was taking its final breaths, the Soviet Union was crumbling, and the United States suddenly faced a rogue dictator who now controlled 20% of the world's proven oil reserves. If Saddam decided to keep his tank columns rolling south into the oil fields of Saudi Arabia, the global economy would be held hostage. The United States, under President George H.W. Bush, drew a line in the sand. Operation Desert Shield was launched, initiating the largest overseas military buildup since the Normandy landings in 1944. But what exactly was the United States up against? On paper, the Iraqi military was a terrifying juggernaut. It was the 4th largest army in the world, boasting nearly 1 million men under arms, over 4,000 tanks, 3,000 artillery pieces, and thousands of armored personnel carriers. At the tip of this spear was the Republican Guard, an elite force loyal directly to Saddam, consisting of heavy armored divisions like the Hammurabi, the Medina, and the Tawakkalna. These were not poorly trained conscripts. They were veterans who had spent 8 years learning how to survive artillery barrages and chemical weapons. The backbone of the Iraqi Armored Corps was the Soviet-designed tank fleet, primarily the T-72, alongside older T-62s and Chinese Type 69s. The T-72 was a low-profile, fast-moving medium tank, equipped with a 125mm smoothbore gun and an autoloader. It looked menacing, but the devil is always in the details. The versions Iraq possessed, known as the T-72 M1, were export variants. In military circles, we call these monkey models. The Soviets deliberately downgraded the armor and fire control systems before selling them abroad. Instead of advanced composite armor, the Iraqi tanks relied on basic steel plates. More importantly, their ammunition was obsolete. They were firing older 3B M9 steel penetrators that had no chance of piercing modern Western armor. Furthermore, their night vision capabilities were severely limited, relying on active infrared spotlights that basically painted a giant target on their turrets for anyone looking through a thermal sight. Iraq's military doctrine was also a fatal vulnerability. Trained by Soviet advisors, the Iraqi officer corps relied on a rigid top-down command structure. Initiative at the lower levels was actively discouraged, a deadly flaw when facing a fast-moving enemy. Saddam's strategy was to dig in and bleed the Americans dry. He constructed a massive defensive network along the Saudi-Kuwait border, known as the Saddam Line. This consisted of towering sand berms, deep trenches filled with crude oil ready to be set on fire, and millions of landmines. He was preparing for the Battle of Kursk, a grinding war of attrition where sheer numbers and static defenses would inflict politically unacceptable casualties on the American public. Did Saddam really think a static defense would work against an enemy that owned the night and the sky? He fundamentally misunderstood the enemy he was facing. The United States military of 1990 was not the same military that had fought in the jungles of Vietnam. It was a completely revitalized, highly professional force built around a revolutionary new doctrine called air-land battle. This doctrine was designed specifically to fight and destroy massive Soviet armored columns in the Fulda Gap of Germany. It emphasized deep strikes, rapid maneuver, decentralized command, and the seamless integration of air and ground power. To execute this doctrine, the United States had spent the 1980s developing the Big Five weapon systems, and the undisputed king of this new arsenal was the M1A1 Abrams main battle tank. If the Iraqi T-72 was a cheap mass-produced hatchet, the Abrams was a 68-ton laser-guided scalpel wrapped in depleted uranium. The M1A1 was powered by a massive 1,500 horsepower Honeywell gas turbine engine. It was essentially a jet engine strapped to a steel box, allowing this massive beast to sprint across the desert at over 45 miles per hour. It was incredibly thirsty, measuring fuel efficiency in gallons per mile rather than miles per gallon. But its mobility was unmatched. The lethality of the Abrams came from its 120mm M256 smoothbore gun, firing the devastating M829A1 armor-piercing, fin-stabilized, discarding sabot round. This round, affectionately known by tank crews as the Silver Bullet, was a dart made of depleted uranium traveling at over 3,500 feet per second. The kinetic energy was so immense that it didn't just penetrate Iraqi armor, it liquefied it, turning the inside of a T-72 into a blazing inferno of molten metal and exploding ammunition. Protecting the American crews was Chobham composite armor, reinforced with depleted uranium mesh, making the Abrams practically invulnerable to anything the Iraqis could shoot at it from the front. But the true game-changer, the technological leap that would turn this war into a one-sided slaughter, was the thermal imaging sight. While Iraqi gunners were staring into the pitch-black desert night through crude starlight scopes, American gunners were looking at high-resolution thermal screens. They could see the heat signatures of Iraqi tanks idling behind sand berms from over 2 miles away, through the pitch-black darkness, through heavy rain, and through the thick smoke of burning oil wells. The Americans could see, shoot, and kill before the Iraqis even knew they were under attack. Supporting the Abrams was the M2 Bradley infantry fighting vehicle, armed with a 25mm chain gun and TOW anti-tank missiles, which would actually end up destroying more Iraqi armor than the Abrams itself. Above them flew the AH-64 Apache attack helicopters, armed with Hellfire missiles, acting as flying tank killers. This was the mechanized fist of the United States Army, primarily concentrated in the heavily armored 7th Corps, commanded by General Frederick and the fast-moving 18th Airborne Corps. However, moving a force of this magnitude is a logistical nightmare that defies human comprehension. You do not just snap your fingers and teleport heavily armored divisions from the forests of Germany to the deserts of Saudi Arabia. The build-up to the ground war was a triumph of military logistics that rivaled the famous Red Ball Express of World War II. The United States had to establish an iron mountain of supplies in the middle of nowhere. We are talking about moving millions of tons of equipment, ammunition, food, and water. An armored division consumes thousands of gallons of water a day just to keep the troops alive in temperatures that routinely spiked to 120 degrees Fahrenheit. The maintenance requirements were staggering. The fine, talcum powder-like chamal sand of the Arabian desert was the enemy of every mechanical part. It chewed up tank tracks, clogged air filters, and destroyed the delicate turbine blades of the Abrams engines. Mechanics worked around the clock in suffocating heat to keep the war machine functioning. Fuel was the lifeblood of this operation. An Abrams tank requires roughly 300 gallons of jet fuel every 8 hours just to keep its systems running. To supply the advancing army, combat engineers laid hundreds of miles of temporary fuel pipelines across the desert floor, while a massive fleet of heavy tactical trucks drove bumper to bumper in endless convoys. How do you hide an armored force the size of the state of Rhode Island in a flat desert? This was the ultimate question facing General Norman Schwarzkopf, the commander of coalition forces. He knew that attacking the Saddam Line head-on would result in a bloodbath. Instead, he devised a masterstroke of operational deception. While the United States Marines and Arab coalition forces visibly built up their strength directly south of Kuwait, fixing the Iraqi army's attention forward, Schwarzkopf secretly moved the entire 7th Corps and 18th Airborne Corps hundreds of miles to the west, deep into the trackless Saudi desert. The Iraqis believed this western desert was impassable for a large armored force. They left their right flank completely exposed. For 38 agonizing days, the coalition air forces pounded the Iraqi military into the sand. Precision-guided munitions dismantled Saddam's command and control, severed his supply lines, and systematically degraded his front-line units. The Iraqi army was blinded, deafened, and bleeding heavily. But air power alone cannot hold ground, and it cannot completely eradicate a dug-in armored force of that size. The time for the ground war had arrived. The trap was set, the logistical lines were primed, and hundreds of thousands of American troops sat in their armored vehicles on the line of departure, listening to the roar of turbine engines echoing across the desert. The greatest armored charge since the Second World War was about to begin. At 0400 hours on February 24, 1991, the silence of the Arabian desert was shattered by the deafening roar of massed artillery. The ground assault, designated G-Day, had officially commenced. But the weather was not cooperating with the meticulously planned American timetable. Instead of clear skies and perfect visibility, the advancing coalition troops were met with a freezing, blinding rainstorm that turned the desert floor into a treacherous soup of mud and grit. How do you punch a hole through a massive wall of fire, sand, and high explosives, without losing thousands of men to a grinding meat grinder. You do not send infantry with wire cutters and Bangalore torpedoes. You send heavy machinery. The 1st Infantry Division, the legendary Big Red 1, spearheaded the breach of the heavily fortified Saddam Line. They utilized the M58 mine-clearing line charge, commonly known as the MIC-LIC. This system fired a rocket dragging a 350-foot nylon rope packed with nearly 2,000 pounds of C4 plastic explosive. When detonated, it vaporized everything in a lane 8 meters wide and 100 meters long, creating a safe, instantaneous path through the dense Iraqi minefields. Following immediately behind the explosions were the M9 Armored Combat Earth Movers. These were essentially heavily armored bulldozers, and they simply ploughed through the massive defensive sand berms, literally burying Iraqi defenders alive in their own trench networks. It was a brutal, industrial-scale clearing operation that completely bypassed the bloody, yard-by-yard infantry attrition seen in the trenches of the First World War or the hedgerows of Normandy. Once through the breach, the heavily armoured 7th Corps began its massive left hook into the featureless Iraqi desert. To understand the sheer audacity of this manoeuvre, we must look at a piece of technology that we take for granted today: the Global Positioning System. In 1991, GPS was in its absolute infancy. Before this conflict, navigating a featureless desert was done by dead reckoning, using magnetic compasses and odometers. It was a highly inaccurate method that famously caused entire armoured columns in the North African campaigns of World War II to get hopelessly lost in the dunes. During Desert Storm, the United States military scrambled to buy commercial GPS receivers, known as SLGRs or sluggers, taping them directly to the dashboards of Humvees and the interiors of tank turrets. For the first time in military history, a mechanized commander moving across hundreds of miles of trackless wasteland knew exactly where his units were, to within a few meters. This technological leap allowed General Frederick to coordinate a massive front of heavy armor, sweeping eastward in a perfectly aligned, devastating wheeling motion. While 7th Corps executed this massive flanking maneuver to the west, the 1st and 2nd Marine Divisions were tasked with the bloody job of punching straight north into Kuwait to fix the Iraqi army in place. They advanced into a literal hellscape. Saddam Hussein, realizing his grip on Kuwait was slipping, had ordered the destruction of over 600 Kuwaiti oil wells. The sky turned pitch black at noon. The temperature plummeted, and a toxic, greasy rain of unburned crude oil coated everything, turning the Marines, their weapons, and their vehicles pitch black. It was in this apocalyptic environment that the M2 Bradley infantry fighting vehicle proved its lethal worth. Critics in the 1980s had called the Bradley a death trap, arguing it was too tall and its aluminum armor too thin to survive a high-intensity conflict. But on the sands of Kuwait and Iraq, the Bradley was a mechanized Grim Reaper. Its primary tank-killing weapon was the BGM-71 TOW missile. The TOW is a tube-launched, optically tracked, wire-guided missile. When the gunner fired, a heavy anti-tank missile flew out of the side launcher, trailing 2 microscopic copper wires behind it. The gunner simply had to keep his crosshairs on the target, and the fire control system sent electrical steering commands down the wires to guide the missile in flight. With a range of over 2 miles, Bradleys were picking off dug-in Iraqi T-55s and T-62s long before the enemy gunners could even elevate their barrels to return fire. The defining clash of this massive armoured sweep occurred on February 26 in a desolate patch of desert known only by its map coordinate, 73 Easting. The 2nd Armoured Cavalry Regiment, acting as the scouting screen for 7th Corps, was pushing rapidly east through a blinding sandstorm. Visibility was reduced to less than 50 meters. The wind howled, completely grounding all Apache attack helicopters and fixed-wing close air support. The ground troops were entirely on their own. This was the exact scenario the Iraqi High Command had hoped for, a close-range, chaotic brawl where American technological advantages in air power and long-range optics would be neutralized by the weather. Or so they thought. Leading the American vanguard was Eagle Troop, commanded by a young captain named H.R. McMaster. He commanded a small, highly mobile force of 9 Abrams tanks and 12 Bradleys. As they crested a slight rise in the desert floor, they stumbled directly into the defensive positions of the Tawakalna Republican Guard Division. The Iraqis had executed a textbook reverse-slope defense, hiding their T-72 tanks behind the ridge to ambush the Americans at point-blank range as they came over the hill. Why would a heavily outnumbered cavalry troop charge headlong into a dug-in armoured brigade, instead of pulling back and calling for artillery support? Because in armoured warfare, momentum is life, and hesitation is death. McMaster did not halt. He ordered his tanks to attack immediately, relying on shock action and training to overwhelm the enemy. What followed was 23 minutes of unparalleled violence. The thermal sights on the Abrams tanks cut through the blinding sandstorm like a hot knife through butter. The Iraqi crews, relying on outdated optical sights, were completely blind in the swirling sand. An American tank would burst through the dust, identify a glowing white thermal signature, fire a depleted uranium sabot round, and destroy an Iraqi tank before the enemy even realized they were under attack. We must also look at the human element of loading the main gun. The autoloader on the Soviet-designed T-72 requires about 8 seconds to cycle around into the breach. An elite American tank crew manually loading their 120mm gun could load and fire in under 5 seconds. In a close-quarters gunfight, those 3 seconds are the difference between life and death. Eagle Troop decimated the Iraqi positions, destroying nearly 30 tanks, 16 personnel carriers, and over 30 trucks without losing a single Abrams tank. This engagement at 73 Easting was the armoured equivalent of the Battle of the Philippine Sea in World War II, famously known as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. It was not a battle. It was a systematic execution. The Iraqi Republican Guard, the supposed elite, battle-hardened veterans of the Iran-Iraq War, were completely outclassed by the speed, training, and technology of the American volunteer military. They fought bravely, many refusing to run from their dug-in positions. But bravery means absolutely nothing when your armor is pierced by a hypervelocity dart traveling at 3 times the speed of sound. Further north, the 1st Armored Division slammed into the Medina Republican Guard Division at the Battle of Medina Ridge. This was the largest tank battle of the war and the largest armored clash since the Battle of Kursk in 1943. Over 3,000 vehicles were involved in a massive, sprawling engagement across the desert floor. The 1st Armoured Division utilized a tactic known as a heavy brigade wedge, a massive V-shaped formation of Abrams tanks moving at 30 miles per hour, firing continuously on the move. The stabilization systems on the M1A1 were an engineering marvel of the late 20th century. Complex gyroscopes kept the main gun locked perfectly onto the target, while the 68-ton chassis bounced and pitched violently over the uneven desert terrain. Iraqi tanks had to come to a complete halt to fire accurately. The Americans did not. This ability to shoot accurately while maneuvering at high speeds completely shattered the Iraqi defensive lines, turning their static positions into a graveyard of burning steel. But this relentless, punishing pace was taking a massive toll on the American logistical tail. The 7th Corps was consuming over 5 million gallons of fuel every single day of the advance. The heavy expanded mobility tactical trucks, or HEMTTs, were struggling desperately to keep up with the advancing armor. These massive 8-wheel drive cargo trucks were the unsung heroes of the ground war. Without them, the mighty Abrams tanks would have become 68-ton paperweights stranded in the middle of the desert. Tankers were executing hot refueling, pumping highly flammable jet fuel into their tanks while the turbine engines were still running, a highly dangerous practice just to maintain the operational tempo. General Franks was pushing his men and machines to the absolute breaking point, terrified that if he slowed down for even a moment, the Iraqi Republican Guard would escape the trap and slip back across the Euphrates River into the safety of central Iraq. The Iraqi army was collapsing under the sheer weight and speed of this armored onslaught. Command and control had completely evaporated. Whole divisions were surrendering en masse, throwing down their weapons to Apache helicopters, and even surrendering to passing unarmed drone aircraft. The vaunted 4th largest army in the world had been reduced to a panicked, disorganized mob, desperately fleeing north toward the safety of the city of Basra. But the only way out of Kuwait was a multi-lane highway leading north, and the United States military was already waiting for them, preparing to turn that stretch of asphalt into one of the most controversial and devastating kill zones in modern military history. Highway 80 was a 6-lane ribbon of asphalt stretching from the Kuwaiti capital straight north toward the Iraqi border city of Basra. By the night of February 26th, it had become the largest military traffic jam in modern history. Thousands of stolen Kuwaiti civilian vehicles, military transport trucks, armored personnel carriers, and T-72 tanks were bumper to bumper packed with fleeing Iraqi soldiers desperately trying to escape the closing American steel trap. They were carrying televisions, jewelry, and whatever loot they could pillage from Kuwait City, hoping the cover of darkness and a massive rainstorm would shield them from the coalition aircraft. But the United States military does not stop fighting when the sun goes down, or when the weather turns sour. At approximately midnight, United States Marine Corps A-6 Intruder attack aircraft located the massive convoy. They did not attack the center of the column. Instead, they dropped Mark 20 Rockeye cluster bombs at the very front of the convoy, near the Medina Ridge bottleneck, and at the very rear. The Rockeye is an unguided canister that splits open in mid-air, dispensing 247 dual-purpose armor-piercing bomblets over a wide area. By destroying the lead and trail vehicles, the American pilots effectively boxed in the entire Iraqi army. There was no forward movement, and there was no retreat. The trap was sprung, and what followed was a demonstration of air-to-ground lethality that remains highly controversial to this day. For the next 10 hours, wave after wave of coalition aircraft descended on the paralyzed column. The undisputed Grim Reaper of this engagement was the A-10 Thunderbolt II, affectionately known as the Warthog. The A-10 was not designed for dogfighting at 30,000 feet. It was essentially a flying titanium bathtub built entirely around the GAU-8 Avenger, a 30mm 7-barrel rotary cannon. This weapon is the size of a Volkswagen Beetle, and fires depleted uranium armor-piercing incendiary rounds at a rate of 3,900 rounds per minute. When an A-10 pilot pulled the trigger, the sound was a terrifying deep roar that tore through the desert air, followed instantly by the complete obliteration of whatever vehicle was in the crosshairs. The Warthogs, alongside F-15 Strike Eagles and Apache helicopters, systematically dismantled the trapped convoy. When the sun finally rose, the devastation was absolute. Over 2,000 vehicles lay completely destroyed, burned down to their steel frames, stretching for miles along the blackened asphalt. It became known to the world as the Highway of Death. We have to look back to August of 1944 to find a historical parallel of this magnitude. During the Battle of the Falaise Pocket in World War II, Allied tactical air power caught the retreating German 7th Army trapped in a narrow corridor in Normandy, turning the country roads into a slaughterhouse of burning Panzer tanks and horse-drawn artillery. Just like the German army in Normandy, the Iraqi army on Highway 80 was completely stripped of its air defenses and exposed to the undisputed masters of the sky. Why did the United States suddenly halt this relentless advance when the road to Baghdad was wide open? The answer lies in the complex intersection of military strategy and global politics. By February 28th, exactly 100 hours after the ground war began, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Colin Powell, advised President George H.W. Bush that the military objectives had been unequivocally achieved. The Iraqi army in Kuwait was destroyed as a cohesive fighting force. Powell was deeply concerned about the optics of the Highway of Death. The American military is built to destroy enemy combatants, but it is not in the business of slaughtering fleeing, defenseless men. Furthermore, the United Nations mandate was strictly limited to the liberation of Kuwait. Marching on Baghdad to topple Saddam Hussein would have fractured the fragile Arab coalition and dragged the United States into a prolonged, bloody occupation. This decision was the direct application of what became known as the Powell Doctrine. This doctrine was born out of the ashes of the Vietnam War. In Vietnam, American forces were bogged down in a slow, creeping mission creep, fighting a war of attrition with ambiguous political goals and severe restrictions on the use of force. The Powell Doctrine demanded the exact opposite. It stated that the United States should only commit military forces if there is a clear, vital national interest, a defined and achievable objective, and if the military is allowed to use overwhelming, disproportionate force to achieve that objective rapidly. Desert Storm was the anti-Vietnam. It was a masterclass in establishing a clear political goal, applying overwhelming kinetic power, and then stopping exactly when the job was done. But the tactical brilliance of the ground commanders would have been impossible without a revolution in military intelligence. For the first time in the history of warfare, a theater commander had a real-time, God's-eye view of the entire battle space. This was made possible by the E-8 Joint Surveillance Target Attack Radar System, or JSTARS. This was a heavily modified Boeing 707 carrying a massive 24-foot radar canoe under its forward fuselage. Flying deep behind friendly lines, the JSTARS utilized synthetic aperture radar and ground-moving target indicators to track the movement of every single Iraqi truck, tank, and supply column across hundreds of miles of desert, regardless of weather or darkness. Consider the Battle of Gettysburg in 1863. General Robert E. Lee marched his Confederate army into Pennsylvania completely blind because his cavalry commander J.E.B. Stuart, was out of position and failed to provide reconnaissance. Lee stumbled into the Union Army by accident, leading to a catastrophic defeat. In 1991, General Norman Schwarzkopf suffered no such blindness. The JSTARS data was beamed directly to command centers, allowing American commanders to vector A-10 Warthogs and Apache helicopters onto moving Iraqi columns before the enemy even realized they were being watched. Information dominance had officially replaced the physical high ground as the most critical terrain on the modern battlefield. We must also examine the staggering economic and logistical realities of this conflict. War is the most expensive human endeavor on Earth, and moving a city of 500,000 troops halfway across the globe is a logistical miracle. The United States Transportation Command activated the fast sealift ships, massive cargo vessels capable of crossing the Atlantic at nearly 30 knots. They moved millions of tons of ammunition, spare parts, and heavy armor from ports in Georgia and Texas directly to the Persian Gulf. To put this in perspective, the United States military transported the equivalent of the entire population and infrastructure of a mid-sized American city, complete with its own hospitals, power grids, and sanitation systems, and rebuilt it in the Arabian desert in just over 6 months. Yet the most shocking statistic of Operation Desert Storm is not the number of tanks destroyed, but the financial ledger. The total cost of the war was approximately $61 billion. However, through a diplomatic masterstroke by Secretary of State James Baker, the United States did not foot the bill. Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Japan, and Germany, recognizing the global economic threat posed by Saddam Hussein, contributed over $52 billion to the coalition effort. The United States essentially orchestrated the largest and most destructive armored campaign since World War II, completely neutralized a major geopolitical threat, and did it almost entirely on the dime of its international allies. The 100 hours of the ground war in Operation Desert Storm fundamentally changed the trajectory of global military doctrine. It officially announced the arrival of the revolution in military affairs. The Soviet Union watched in absolute horror as their premier export equipment, the exact same tanks and air defense systems guarding Moscow and Eastern Europe, were systematically dismantled by American precision-guided munitions and digital networking. The era of industrial-scale attrition warfare, where victory was decided by who could produce the most artillery shells and conscript the most men, was officially over. It was replaced by an era of precision strike warfare, where the ability to see first, process information faster, and strike with pinpoint accuracy from beyond visual range became the ultimate arbiters of victory. However, this spectacular success carried a hidden, dangerous poison. The sheer ease and speed of the victory in 1991 created a dangerous illusion in the minds of Western politicians and the American public. It created the expectation that all future wars would be fast, relatively bloodless, and fought entirely on American terms, using smart bombs and thermal optics. It blinded military planners to the grim reality that enemies adapt, and that not every adversary will be foolish enough to line up thousands of tanks in an open desert to be slaughtered by American air power. The destruction of the Iraqi army in 100 hours remains a testament to the lethality of a highly trained, technologically superior volunteer force operating at the peak of its logistical capacity. It was a fleeting moment in history where the perfect doctrine met the perfect terrain against an enemy perfectly suited to be destroyed by it. As we look back at the burning sands of Kuwait, we are reminded that technology may change the speed of battle, but the brutal, unforgiving nature of war remains eternally the same. Now we want to hear your strategic assessment in the comments below. What was the single most critical factor in the American victory during Operation Desert Storm? Was it A, the technological superiority of the M1 Abrams and thermal imaging? Was it B, the absolute dominance of coalition air power blinding the Iraqi army? Or was it C, the logistical miracle of moving and supplying 500,000 troops in the desert? Let us know your choice and your reasoning in the comments.